Now, keep in mind, I had no idea I had a Coinbase account. It was just like, did I do that? Like, this was like 2014. So then it all kind of came back to me in this memory that I'd written an article about Bitcoin in 2013 or 14, and they paid me in Bitcoin.
Hey everybody, welcome to a fresh episode of Money Chronicles. I'm Johnny Sandquist with my co-host Tori Hoppy.
Yes, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
And we're stoked to have Michael Halloran, head of partnerships over at MaxMyInterest, going to dig into your money story. Welcome to the show.
Fantastic. I'm very excited to be here.
Man, so Money Chronicles is all about a show about, your personal money chronicles. Kind of peel back the layers of just the professional veneer and kind of get into, the why behind everything. Just kind of kicking us off, let's dive into your personal story. Just give us the Michael lore. How did you get to where you are now?
Well, I love it. I hadn't thought about this question in a while, so it's exciting to kind of think a little bit about your past. So if I look back, I grew up in the Boston area. I don't think I have a Boston accent anymore, but grew up in the suburbs. So,
can you say car real quick?
Car.
Yeah, you lost no Boston accent.
Yeah, you're good. You're in the clear.
Well, my wife says sometimes if I say certain words like drawer, and she's like, "Wait, say that again." I think, I don't know, but I've lived all over. I actually went to grad school in London. I don't think I picked up an accent from being over there, but I've lived a lot of different places. Lived in New York, and I've been on the West Coast for about 15 years. So thinking back to my kind of journey, I think first thing I remember about money was, I think I was in the Cub Scouts, and I think my dad gave me a quarter for getting some badge. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I have a quarter, because I don't know how old I was. I must have been in third grade or something. And then later, someone else gave me $1 for something that I'd done, like a good turn or something. And there was like a crisp dollar bill. And I just so if I remember the first memory of money, it was like a quarter and $1. So, I mean, it sounds ridiculous. It sounds ridiculous.
Did it seem like so much to you? Like
It
you were
did.
like, wow, I rule the world with my $1.25.
Exactly. I think so, because I think, your parents pay for stuff. I didn't really have money. And so to be actually given a physical, like, paper money or a quarter was kind of exciting at the time. But anyway,
yeah,
I hadn't thought of that memory until thinking about coming on and talking about where was your first memory. And that was kind of a crazy, it's not very much, but that's my first memory right there. So
that's fantastic.
I always love the innocence of kids when they like my son, for example. Like, I know we've talked about it many times on many episodes about our kids and money, but they're in such a digital world, right? So like everything is on their Greenlights accounts or their Robux accounts. Like nothing is really tangible. But when he gets like physical money, he's always like, oh, I could buy that. And it's like, well, buddy, that's like $300. He's like, well, I have that cash. And I'm like, you have $25. Like,
right.
You don't have 300 of them. So it's always so funny because kids always think that which is so great, right? Like they feel so blessed to get $1.25.
Right.
But
that's crazy.
It's always so funny listening to kids and like their vision of what they could really buy with that money.
I have one funny digital currency story. So I think maybe everyone has a crypto story, but my story is I had left Morgan Stanley. I was looking to go work in FinTech. When I started off my career in consulting, I was involved in the launch of the first online bank in the UK. It was called Egg. The idea was a brand that was kind of totally off the wall. And so later, when I was leaving Morgan Stanley, trying to go back into that startup world, I started a blog about FinTech. So I did that for a couple of years, called the FinTech blog. And I remember getting contacted, to write articles about, cybercurrency, cryptocurrency and so forth. Anyway, long story short, about 3 years ago, when crypto was hitting about $20,000, something just sort of came to me because I'd forgotten about that time in my life. And I pulled over. I was driving in Mill Valley, California, and I pulled over and I just went to Coinbase because I said, I think there was something I did with this. I don't know. And so I type in Coinbase.com and a little warning comes up. It says, alert, you have a high value account. You should add multi-factor authentication immediately. Now, keep in mind, I had no idea I had a Coinbase account. It was just like, did I do that? Like, this was like 2014. So then it all kind of came back to me in this memory that I'd written an article about Bitcoin in 2013 or 14, and they paid me in Bitcoin. So I had one Bitcoin, and then I think I bought a half a Bitcoin. But anyway, that was worth a lot more because like that was like 300. It was like $300 when they paid me to write this article for the Daily Coin Graph or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was my crypto story. So that's more than a quarter, more than $1. Anyway, I sold it immediately.
Amazing.
I'll have to say, I was like,
I feel like that's a decent decision. That's a pretty good
Yeah.
That's a pretty good return. Man,
Yeah.
when I first started 3 Crowns, I met a guy here in Omaha who was very into digital currency, and he wanted to pay me to write blogs for him in Bitcoin. And that was the point of time when Bitcoin was like, you went to a Bitcoin ATM to like buy Bitcoin. I was like, this is nuts. Like, I started a business with $0 in revenue. I'm not going to get paid in Bitcoin. And now I realized that was a bad decision.
Right.
But, you know, I should have taken the Michael approach.
Yeah. No, at the time, you think I wasn't born yesterday. Like, I'm not going to be paid.
It's like, I have to buy groceries, man.
Yeah, completely. That's crazy.
But yeah. Did you always, was finance always something you wanted to get into? Was that what you did in college, or was your path more accidental?
No, it was definitely accidental. So when I was much younger, I wanted to go to MIT and be a scientist. I think I was always interested in sort of technical things. And I was a bit of, like when I was growing up, computers were just sort of starting. So I got I think the first Mac that came out, and it was a big deal. And I remember actually seeing Steve Jobs speak at the Boston Computer Society. And I was like a little kid, but it was so iconic, and, the Super Bowl commercial, and I was young. So I actually thought I was going to go in more of a technical route. And then in college, I think I just sort of decided that I wanted to not be the sort of person in the computer lab anymore, and I just wanted to be out there with people. I think I discovered girls. I think there was just a whole transformation that I became much more social and less, like of a coder. So how I actually ended up getting into finance was, I think I mentioned a little bit earlier, when I was working in management consulting. I was actually based in London, and we helped launch the first online bank. But I think that experience led to my working at an interactive agency called Razorfish, or called Scient in the day. So it's the .com period. And the way it works often in consulting is I think about half of consulting is to financial services companies. And, there's manufacturing and others, but it's about similar, I think, to agencies, where it's just a big part of the economy. So you end up working in that space, and it's challenging, and there's so many different companies. And so I think I sort of stumbled into it for that reason. But I always sort of felt it was kind of a world I felt comfortable in. I think writing is also something I enjoy doing. Writing, talking to people, telling stories. In fact, I'll never forget, I was at T3 it was the one in San Diego about 3 years ago. And my son and family came along, and then he actually wanted to come into the conference. And I thought, I'm, middle-aged guy. I'm here at this conference booth, like a trade show. And I thought, I don't know, how will my son think of this? He was floored. He said, wait, you get paid to explain things to people and talk to them, and they ask you questions, and you have to figure out what the answer that. And he said, that sounds fantastic. And it's funny, but actually I do enjoy talking to people. And they ask well, how does that work? Explain that. So that's how I kind of ended up in the industry.
And I love that, again, we started this podcast to find out the true human of everyone here, building this space out. And I think too, we are all raising the next gen of the finance space. Johnny and I have always joked, our kids think that we just sit in a room and talk to people all day. Yeah. Even our kids, they kind of did their own podcasting. It was so cute. But they literally, when we asked them what we did as a job, they're like, you just sit and talk to yourself in a room. And they thought it was boring. So it's it's always so funny for them to see what we actually do, like outside of these confined walls that we now call offices at home. But speaking of that, like, how do you remember how, like, I know we are all struggling to figure out how we are teaching our kids about money because it's so different than when we were growing up. But do you remember, like, your parents teaching you about money? Was there always like this defined, like, thing that your parents did to help you understand what money was?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. But actually, before I answer it, I just want to something you just said sounded so interesting about like the next generation. And so it just reminded me that when I was at T3 in San Diego, Joel came by and I said to Joel, I hope you don't mind, that my son came in. I don't has a ticket, but they said it was okay. And he, like total deadpan, he said, honestly, I wish more people did that. He said, I think it's great to have young people here. He said, I think that's fantastic. I'm glad he's here. But to answer your question about what my parents first said to me, my dad told me, he's passed away, but my late father told me that his dad had always said to him, try to save 10% of your income. And as long as you do that, pretty much everything else will work out. You just have to make sure, pay yourself first. So it's kind of a truism that they say out there, but I think to get it from your dad, kind of like getting that quarter where it's like, you're just younger, you're not as cynical. And so just to kind of hear that, I think really did have an impact on me. And so I think that's one of the first things that I remember for sure.
Yeah. And I always find it really interesting too, because like there was this unspoken rule in my house. Like we never really like openly talked about money. I remember being younger, like my parents weren't super well off, but like by the time I was probably, I don't know, 7, 8, my mom had finished up her master's in nursing. Like we were pretty, from there on, pretty well set. But my mom, I mean, to this day, she still balances her checkbook every Sunday because, they would get paid and we were on a very, linear budget. There was no means of like, hey, we're going to go to Chick-fil-A tonight because I'm too lazy to make something. Like my parents joke with my son all the time about how, if I got a Happy Meal, like it was because like it was something special, or like my dad would always run us through like after going to the dentist. So it was like like there was something happening, not because it was Tuesday and you had golf practice, right? So like it's always so interesting to see like the differences between, like I had a very blessed childhood. Like there's nothing I would change. Like I lived with everything I ever wanted and more. But like it definitely is like I look at myself and like, oh, my child is really spoiled. But how does he know any different? Because I was pretty spoiled. But it's so funny because, like you said, learning that from your dad, saying, save 10%, that doesn't really mean anything, right? When you're 20 and you start your first job and you're like, okay, whatever. But now that you like really look back, you're like, okay, that did stick.
Yeah, it did. And then you pass it on. And then, hopefully you're doing Hopefully you're doing something right. Maybe buying too much Roblox for them or too much Chick-fil-A, but at least maybe
so many Robux.
So many Robux. How combined we could have come up with that game, guys? Like I will say it time and time again, those creators, genius.
I know. It's crazy. I was actually working in a co-working space outside of San Francisco, and it was somehow the founder of Roblox's like outsourced family office. And I just heard the conversations like, we need to have a private plane strategy for Mr. So-and-so, and it was just so much about, and I thought, well, we're paying for the private plane because we are buying Roblox.
That's true.
And this,
it's so true.
So true. Yeah. I feel like so many of our conversations come down to talking about like generational learnings, generational differences. So, you're talking about how your parents taught you about like, okay, that foundational thing that stuck in your mind was save 10%. How are you transferring, what they taught you, onto your son, and how's the way that you teach him different than how they taught you?
Yeah, I do think that the story I told you that I remember was very simple. It was sort of like one thing, save 10%. It was good because it stood out. But if I look back, where I think everyone's made mistakes over their life and you have to kind of acknowledge that. And so I think that while I always had that lesson, there were things that I didn't internalize, like, you should spend like about a third of your money on rent or something like that. And I remember thinking like, wait, that wasn't explained. Is that gross or net? And this was like before the internet. And I just remember that at certain points, especially when you're in your 20s, you're like, oh, well, that's $3,000 a month, but like, that's that 30%, or is that like 40 net tax? And so something. And then you kind of find yourself like, wow, it's a little tight this month. I guess I didn't have everything lined up. So what I think I tried to do, like to answer your question, Tori, is like with my daughter, she's in college in Boston, and she was looking to rent an apartment with a roommate, go off campus. And she said, so how much am I going to need for that? And so I had to come up with a different number. And so I don't know if you know this. I always love these rules of thumb, but it's like 40 times your income, or 40 times your rent should be your income. So if it's $3,000 a month, you should have, 120,000 in income. So while to her, 3,000 a month split two ways doesn't sound like a lot. You say, well, to actually pay 3,000 a month, you should be making 120 per year. Like, you're a student, but that's what that is. And so I've tried to be a little more specific about things, because I think you have to not only just give the big lesson, but also be a little more specific. Because sometimes they might hear one thing, like, but not hear, how it all ties together. Yeah.
I know, like when I was in college, like we were just starting out with like digital payment, right? Like the ACHs and that sort of thing. And now everything, like you can Venmo, Zelle, Apple Pay, everything. So like the transfer of money is so fast and easy for them. So I, like writing a check out for my rent in college was like probably the last checks I've written since then. But like having to even fill that out, like I had to call, I distinctly remember. So I had finally moved out of the dorms, because being an athlete, you had to live in the dorms for at least 2 years. And then I lived in the sorority house because that seemed like a great idea at the time. And then I finally moved out into an apartment like my senior year, and I had to write a check, give to the person, like my parents had put the money in my account, and I had to walk the check in for my rent. I didn't know how to fill that out. Like, so I had to call my mom and my dad and be like, how do you do this? Like, what am I supposed to do? Like, what do I put on these boxes? Who signs this? Because like, my name's at the top of the check, but like my parents' names are listed below because it was a student account. I'm like, am I even allowed to sign this? Am I committing fraud? Like, what is going on? So it's like those little things that like, you think you're doing really great as a parent because like, they're like, we budgeted and I knew that I had to pay the rent on the first of the month and like take this check down. But like the little nuance was like, how do you fill this out? And like spelling the word thousand, I was like, oh, is that even spelt right? Well, they take that if it's spelt wrong. Like all these things I remember just so distinctly trying to get that first rent check down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember that if you made a mistake on the check, you have to initial it. If you spelled thousand with like a W, you're like, oh, I have to initial that. You're like, what are we?
Stressful.
Right. And now our kids have no idea what a paper check is. They're like, what?
Zero.
It's like a rotary phone. They're like, what? You write it on a piece of paper?
We were laughing. I had to write a check for my son's, like something for football, which is a whole other thing. And like I had to dig one out. I could not tell you the last time I wrote one. And so I'm like writing it down and I hand it to my son. I'm like, hey, can you give this to your coach or whatever? He's like, why am I giving him a piece of paper? And I'm like, that piece of paper is money. Do not lose it. Like directly from the car, the 50 yards, I need you to give that to like your coach. And he's like, well, it's just a piece of paper. And I'm like, oh no, it's not.
I know. I think my mom sends like birthday checks to my son, and I think he doesn't cash them because he's like, where do I take it? I guess I
do this.
Take it somewhere, or I don't know, because they don't even scan it because they don't have checks.
Oh.
I don't know what that is.
And going to a bank, that's like a foreign concept. That doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I avoid that. Like, I do not want to go to the bank ever.
Yeah.
I can't remember the last time
I have a crazy story about going to the bank. Okay, so as I mentioned, so I lived overseas for a while. And so in London in the 90s, believe it or not, when you went to your branch, like Barclays Bank, if you went to a different branch, they may not be able to tell you your balance without calling the other branch. And I just remember at the time thinking, is this like a joke they're playing on me? And they're like, no, because you opened it at this other location. And so like, it's just pretty amazing to me that still happened back then, whereas now everything's online. No one goes to the branch. Like that has
Right.
no meaning whatsoever. Right. And then the other thing they did is loan decisions were made by the branch manager. And you can see this on like TV shows, like, the branch manager. And so, everything was done by people. And it was like, I'm going to look at your paper application, discuss it with you, and then decide if you are a good. Now it's all online with, scoring and very complicated, but
yeah.
Amazing how much it's changed. We don't realize how much it's changed, but it's changed a lot.
Yeah.
Michael, earlier you said like, hey, you just said this very innocuous phrase. We all make mistakes, right? But that's our favorite question to wrap up these with. So what has been your worst money mistake, and what did it teach you, or what did you learn from it?
Yeah. So I think it might have been related to what I was mentioning earlier about not sort of understanding like, what's pre-tax versus post-tax or things like that. So it's been decisions like that about how much, you're spending like pre-tax, after tax. And I think there weren't really the articles out there about like financial planning, and you often didn't have guidance. So you'd be saving 10%, but you wouldn't be doing the other things like, is that, oh, I put my 401k, it was 10%. So is that enough? So I think it's, I think about, financial planning software. That's so helpful, I think, for clients to just sort of bring everything visually. Everyone's a different type of learner. So I think my mistake was sort of focusing too much on that one thing I was told as a little kid, as opposed to like, do that. Oh, and by the way, also make sure each month you don't, more than 28% of your after tax on rent. It's little things like that, all those little, which, over time you learn from your mistakes, and it's all been fine. But I think those are the things that I remember is sort of not all the attention to the details about all the little things you have to pay attention to. So.
Yeah. And I think it's so important that, we as in the financial service industry, we're trying to make this less complicated for people to understand. There's so much jargon in our industry, and a lot of people just assume that the everyday person knows what that jargon is, and they don't. Like, and how could they, or why should they? Right? Like, it's a lot for them to ingest. Right? My mom is an ER nurse. I don't know. I'm not expected to know every terminology that she does when I walk into an ER. Why do we expect clients to walk into a financial service office knowing, what gross income means? What does after taxes mean? Like, we have such high standards for people to understand, because they're like, well, it's their money. They know it, but it's like, they don't. I mean, we just had this big conversation in our household about, yesterday was tax day, and we're recalculating for 2024, right? And like, did we do this right? And there was a huge discussion, hot debate in my house was like, what is our after tax income, after gross income, and what do we set our standard on? Do we do it on our total income or after, our deductions or whatever the case may be? And it's like, I mean, literally it was a all day texting affair back and forth with my husband of like, which one are we choosing? And I'm like, I can tell you what we're going to choose because I do this a lot. Like, but it was really funny because again, he's, he's in the space adjacent, but he's just like, no, you're right. Like, the government looks at after taxes on what you're going to be taxed on. So
yeah, no,
anyway,
I love what you said about really jargon. We're trying to banish jargon, at our company. And it's funny, one of the things I always love the story, like Winston Churchill was once presented with the story of like, they were creating the Home Guard, and it was called like the Citizens Defense Auxiliary. And he struck a pen through it and said, no, we're calling it the Home Guard, an Anglo-Saxon word that's simple to understand. And so I had that discussion with our founder, Gary Zimmerman, because he created intelligent cash management for advisors. And And I said, no, it's higher yield. It's like earn more. And I think you just sometimes have to go with the phrase that just people understand like instantly, as opposed to too much jargon. So big fan of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a pleasure to get to know you better and just hear about your story.
Great. I've enjoyed being here. It's been great to speak with both of you, and I look forward to seeing you at a future conference.